Chapter 26, Squirrel Huntin'. Because Greg and Gray were born in the shadow of their big brothers, they had to grow up fast and tough. Gray was built solid like a fire plug. He was a wrestler. Greg, on the other hand, was about the same size as his little brother, but his big brothers bragged that he was wiry. He was a fighter. Together, they were a force of nature and easily stood up for themselves against their older brothers, or anyone else for that matter. One day at school, a fifth-grade bully mistakenly made a comment about their mother. He was creative in the way he said it. Instead of calling her a word for a disreputable woman, he emphasized his point by calling her a couple of blankety-blank-blank-blanks. Greg was in the third grade. Gray was in the first. They hadn't had time to learn too much yet at school, but one thing they did know: nobody says anything about their mama. Greg sailed into the boy, nearly twice his height, and knocked the wind out of him. Just as the bully recovered enough to grab Greg, Gray came at him, running. He didn't slow down when he hit the bully. He just kept going and ran right up his chest. He grabbed the kid around the head and kicked over backwards. The bully went flying sideways and landed on the ground. Then Greg landed on him. Before the teacher pulled them off, they were satisfied they'd successfully defended their mother's honor. Another time, Greg and Gray announced they were going squirrel hunting. Their older brothers, who occasionally underestimated them, scoffed and asked, "With what?" "Don't worry about it," they said. "You'll see when we come home with a bunch of squirrels." Greg, who would have been about 9 at the time, whistled for his dog Glory and headed off the hill with his little brother. They hiked the mile around the hillside. Instead of crossing the river at Racine, they followed the road around to the mouth of Indian Creek. As they walked, they kept a sharp lookout for squirrels. Sure enough, after about a half-mile, they spotted a fat gray squirrel perched in the fork of a hickory tree. Glory commenced barking and leaping against the trunk of the tree. Gray looked at Greg and asked, "Now what?" "We're going to rock the snot out of that squirrel," said Greg. Now, of all the boys, Greg was the deadliest with a rock. He had a remarkable aim that made him the best basketball shot of the family and the only brother to play pitcher in baseball. Gray followed his example in picking up a handful of rocks, and together they began to bombard the squirrel. Although it dodged behind the trunk and tried to hide among the leaves, it may just as well have shinnied down the tree and offered itself up peacefully. As it was, somebody's rock caught it when it wasn't looking and knocked it from its perch. Glory took care of the rest. "That's one," said Gray. "Let's go for some more." The boys ambled along the road with their trophy hanging from their belt, constantly scanning the trees. At last they spotted another, but it got away. Later on they saw another, but it managed to escape as well. Finally they cornered one in a smaller tree that had no place to hide. Another well-aimed rock brought it down, and Glory finished it off. Greg and Gray looked at one another. "Well, that's one for you and one for me," said Greg. "You reckon we ought to be heading home?" After a long, dusty walk, Greg and Gray entered the house. Their older brothers looked up from a puzzle they were working. Eddie sniggered. "Any luck?" he asked sarcastically. "Yeah," chimed in Jimmy and Scotty. "Did you get anything?" they said, trying to hold back a laugh. With that, Greg plunked 2 fat squirrels on the table. He looked at Gray and then at his big brothers. With a twitch in his jaw and a Clint Eastwood glint in his eye, he said, "Yeah, I reckon we did."